We are going back into our series, The Good, the Bad, and the Faithful, which is on the book of Genesis. Yes, and we're going to wrap it up in the month of April. So the end of April, we'll end this series, and we'll be moving on from there. If you're interested in where we're going after that, you've got some of that on the back of your notes. We're going to start out, we're in the middle of the story of Jacob today, and we're going to go through much of the rest of his life. Remember, we're looking sort of a bird's eye view during this section of people's entire lifetimes. We looked at Abraham's whole lifetime, Isaac's whole lifetime, and we're doing a few parts for Jacob's. But today is going to show us how God works in us over a long period of time and what that sometimes takes. Our illustration for today, we always start out with an illustration, and our illustration today is Lieutenant Dan. Who remembers Lieutenant Dan from Forrest Gump? Now, some of you younger people, has anybody not seen this movie? Is there people in here who... Okay, so if you are, it mostly was young people who just raised their hands. You should really go watch this movie, right? The rest of you say, yes, you really should. If you want to know kind of what was the 20th century like, this movie gives you an amazing view, both, down-to-earth view. The movie is Forrest Gump. But Lieutenant Dan is a key figure in Forrest Gump. And so his life in the movie, he's not a real person, but I'm sure there were people like him. His life has a couple different phases. So in the beginning, when he enters the story, he is a lieutenant, and he's in the Vietnam War. And do you remember the thing about his family is what? What was the thing about his family? Someone in his family had fought and died in every major American war. That was the thing. And so he knew his destiny was to fight and die in the Vietnam War. That was his destiny, and he was going to make it happen. He was a man in control of his fate. And then, in a firefight, he almost died, and Forrest Gump rescued him from dying. And Forrest, carries him out while Lieutenant Dan's yelling at Forrest Gump, "Don't save me, I'm supposed to die." Okay, and Forrest saves him anyway, and then he loses his legs, and he doesn't know what to do with the rest of his life. He gets into this depression. The plan that he had for his life has been ruined. You can't see in this picture, I'll show you in just a minute, but he has no legs at this point, so he's super depressed. He gets addicted to drugs. He becomes like this hippie kind of guy. But then he eventually makes it back to a relationship with Forrest Gump. And in that relationship, Forrest takes him onto a shrimping boat in Louisiana, and they try to become shrimp fishermen, even though neither of them have ever done this before and don't know how to do it. And so how much shrimp do they catch at first? Nothing. They catch like a toilet seat that was in the bayou or something. But then there's this crazy moment where Lieutenant Dan has a fight with God. There's this moment where they are out on this shrimping boat, and a hurricane hits. And they decide to stay out in the hurricane because Lieutenant Dan is so mad at God, he just wants to fight God until he dies. You ruined my life, God. Lieutenant Dan doesn't even really necessarily believe God exists. I don't know, but yet he wants to fight with God at the same time. And so this is an iconic image. Go watch this scene. Just YouTube it or something. He's on the top of the mast, just screaming at God into the darkness. And somehow, their ship survives the hurricane. And what happens after that is all the other ships, all the other shrimping boats have been destroyed in the hurricanes. They're the only one left. And so they catch a ton of shrimp, and they become really rich and famous and all this stuff. But the point is not that they become rich and famous. This is a picture of him without the legs. And this is the moment, there's a scene in here after that storm, after that battle that Lieutenant Dan has with God, where Lieutenant Dan finds peace. He finds peace with God. He recognizes he sort of spent all his angry energy, and he gets it out, and God is big enough to take it. And Lieutenant Dan comes to a place where he says, you know what? I was never in control of my life to begin with. It was always him. And the rest of his life, he's just going to live that way, with his hands open. This is what we're going to see today, very, very similar to this, happen with Jacob. It's what we're going to see happen with Jacob in the second half of his life. We're in this series, The Good, the Bad, and the Faithful, on this origin stories, our origin story in Genesis. The good is God and the things that God does. The bad are human beings going from bad to worse, turning away from God. And the faithful, which you can see, it's not black or white. The faithful are often living a dysfunctional life and messed up in all kinds of ways, but these are people who heard the call of God and tried to follow him. Often in messing up continually, but they tried to follow him. Genesis, the theme here, Genesis is a little bit like the Wild West, and we're going to see that today. There's going to be a moment where Jacob is literally with his family riding full speed on camels to escape the people behind him who are trying to kill him, but he's riding toward other people who are trying to kill him. And all the people trying to kill him are part of his family. Crazy. It's a crazy moment in Jacob's life. So it's a little bit like the Wild West. We're going to see that today. The book of Genesis, we said this a lot of times earlier in our series, and if you weren't here for a lot of that, I would encourage you to go back and look at some of those messages. Much of Genesis is about our origin, and then the whole second half, the whole second section, which is most of the book, is about a chosen family, right? Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and their descendants, who are going to become the models of faith for us today. And so that's what we're going through that section right now. So, Jacob, we left on a cliffhanger, right? Jacob, if you remember anything about him, he was the manipulator. And I think one of the best ways to think about Jacob and what his personality was like is, have you ever met a person who was a natural salesman? They could sell, as they say, right, ice to an Eskimo or something, right? Ice to the Inuit. He was a natural salesman, and he could convince people of things and manipulate people around him very well. And that was his life. He stole things from his brother. He stole his brother's inheritance. He stole his brother's blessing from his dad. And then he had to flee for his life because his brother, Esau, was not, Esau wasn't probably actually very smart, but Esau was like a soldier kind of guy. He was an outdoorsman, and he was going to kill his brother. He was going to kill Jacob for doing all this stuff. And so Jacob ran for his life. And he really had no connection. He wasn't really following God. He knew about God. He knew that his grandfather had followed God. He knew that his dad had followed God. But he had no direct connection with God, this God that had called his ancestors to go into a new land. He had no direct connection with God. And he's running away for his life, and he lays down to sleep at night in the middle of nowhere, and he has a dream, and God shows up in that dream. And he shows him all these visions. He says, Jacob, I'm going to do great things through your life. And Jacob wakes up from that, and if you remember, there's this amazing line where Jacob says, the Lord was in this place. He was right here, and I never knew it. I was totally unaware of it. And we said then a few weeks ago that this is where most of us are very often. God is right here with us, but most of the time we don't know it. We don't recognize it. And then Jacob, of course, takes exactly the wrong conclusion from what God tells him. Okay, God tells him, it's going to be a process, Jacob. I'm going to put you through a lot of stuff. I'm going to do great things in your life. And so this was the piece. God says, I'm going to be with you and watch over you wherever you go, and I'm going to bring you back to this land. Now, if you are a Christian, especially if you're a mature Christian, what you're going to see in these verses is God is telling Jacob, I'm really the one who's in control of your life. I'm sovereign. I'm going to be with you wherever you go, and I'm going to be the one who brings you back here after you flee and lots of stuff happens to you. I know your future, and I'm not going to leave you. This is actually a promise. I'm not going to leave you, he says, until I've accomplished what I plan to accomplish in your life. Jacob hears all this from God and comes to exactly the wrong conclusion. Okay? Here's Jacob's conclusion. God is here to make my life better. This is what Jacob thinks. He hears God say, I'm going to do this amazing thing in your life, and Jacob wakes up and goes, wow, I am really a great guy. I'm amazing. The God of the universe wants to make me a great person. And he has this thing where he says, if God does all this stuff for me, then I will worship him. I'll worship him. So Jacob goes off. He knows that God has made him this promise, but he's still trying to make his life He wants to be a great one. He and his ancestors have actually been called to build a new nation. And this is what Jacob wants to do. He wants to become rich and powerful and have this nation, but he's trying to do it, we'll see, all in his own power. Yet God is sovereign. God is in control over all that. So we're going to go through a bunch of stuff in Jacob's life that covers a number of chapters. Chapter 28 all the way up to chapter 32 in Genesis. And we're just going to hit on a few things that happened to him so that we can have this bird's eye view of his life. And then we're going to get to one moment in his life, and that's going to be sort of our main point and conclusion for today. So this is where we left him. The next thing that happens to him convinces him even more that God loves him and he's a really special one. Okay, he goes back to the place where his grandpa was from, this town of Haran, and he meets, the first thing that happens, he gets to this well, and he meets this super gorgeous young woman and falls madly in love with her. Okay, this is actually an amazing painting by William Dice of Jacob and Rachel meeting at the well. Look at that painting. I was stunned by this. I put up a lot of famous paintings of biblical scenes for you guys. That's something that helps me. This one is my favorite of this entire series. This shows exactly what Jacob was like when he met Rachel. How into Rachel is Jacob? Answer the question, how? Scale of 1 to 10. Like 25, right? He is fully into Rachel. How into Jacob is Rachel? She's kind of uncertain. She's let him take her hand, but she's also leaning backwards, isn't she? There's a lot going on in Rachel, and we're going to see what Jacob doesn't know when he meets Rachel is that she is an even better manipulator than he is. In his family of origin, he was the great manipulator. But in this new place that he's gone, this city that he goes to, almost everyone he encounters is at least as good a manipulator as he is. He's a salesman among salespeople at this point. And he doesn't realize it. He thinks he can still outsmart everybody, but he can't. So the next thing that happens is the salesman, Jacob, gets sold. He gets sold a bill of goods. But what's really going on behind this is that God is setting a trap for Jacob. And that sounds bad. Would God set a trap for us? Doesn't God love us? Yes, God would set a trap for you for your good. God sets a trap for Jacob for a purpose. He confronts Jacob with himself. Why does he bring Jacob into this family of manipulators? Because that's who Jacob is. You remember what his name means? The one who causes his brother to stumble. That's what the name Jacob means. The trickster, the con man. That's what his parents named him. What? That's crazy. Okay, but God is confronting Jacob with himself so that he can see who he really is and get to the place where real change can happen in his life. God has probably done something similar in your life as well. Laban is Jacob's uncle. There's a lot of names in here, and we don't need to remember all of them necessarily. But here's how it goes. Laban had 2 daughters. The name of the older was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. Leah had weak eyes. We don't really know what that means, but Jacob didn't like the way she looked as much as he liked the way Rachel looked. But Rachel had a lovely figure and was beautiful. We saw Jacob was really into her. Jacob was in love with Rachel and said, I'll work for you, he says to Laban, Rachel's dad. I'll work for you for 7 years in return for your younger daughter, Rachel. And Laban says, oh yes, this is a great deal. Laban said, it's better that I give you to her than to some other man, so stay here with me. And so Jacob served 7 years to get Rachel, but they seemed like only a few days to him because of his love for her. That's a beautiful statement, but it's also in the context of a great manipulation. Jacob says to Laban at the end of the 7 years, give me my wife, my time is completed, I want to make love to her. The Bible is very straightforward about certain things at times. He's waited 7 years, right? 7 years. Laban brought together all the people of the place and gave a feast. And when the evening came, he took his other daughter, Leah, and brought her to Jacob. And Jacob married her. How could Jacob possibly be tricked this way? It's not all that important, but this is realistic in that setting, right? There would have been a lot of things going on here. First of all, the bride would have been veiled. Okay, she would have been veiled probably right up until the time they went into the tent on the wedding night. It would have been very dark. There's no electric lights. There was probably also alcohol involved in this situation. Okay, so it's not till the next morning. It's not till the next morning that Jacob realizes, this is a stunning line. When morning came, there was Leah. What? He wakes up and realizes he's married the wrong person. But there's no going back at this point. Certainly not in their culture, right? Like going back on that would mean death. That's what it would mean. So Jacob says to Laban, what have you done to me? I served you for Rachel. Why have you deceived me? Laban replied, well, this is not our way, right? To give the younger daughter first. Sorry I didn't tell you about it for 7 years. I knew really what's going on. He knows that she's maybe not as good looking as Rachel. And she's the older daughter. And he's a manipulator. And he's better than Jacob. And so he finds a way to get Leah married. That's really what's going on. Okay? But he says, you know what? Hey, finish Leah's bridal week. Okay, there's like a week-long honeymoon. And then we'll give you Rachel too. You can have both as long as you work for me for another 7 years. Just be my slave. And what does Jacob do? He does it. Okay? So he's stuck in this family of manipulators. And next thing I'm going to show you, so he works for another 7 years, and he actually stays with Laban even longer than that. But the next thing I'm going to show you is what Jacob's life was like. Have you ever wanted something really, really badly and then you got it and it wasn't quite what you expected? This is what happens to Jacob. He is so in love with Rachel. He wants her to be his wife so badly. And when he finally gets there, what he discovers is that both of these women he's married are master manipulators. And what they spend their time doing is they spend their time manipulating him so that they can compete with each other to have more children. That's their whole plan. We're going to compete with each other. Whoever has more kids wins and gets to be the real best wife of Jacob. And Jacob is like a pawn in their scheme. Let me show you what I mean. When the Lord saw that Leah was not loved, because Jacob really wasn't too into her, he enabled Leah to conceive, but Rachel remained childless. Leah became pregnant and gave birth to a son. She named him Reuben. She said, it's because of the Lord. The Lord has seen my misery. Now, notice this. Leah and Rachel, who are Jacob's wives at this point, have heard about the Lord. This is the name of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This is Yahweh. They've heard about the Lord. But we don't see Jacob worshiping the Lord or praying to the Lord at all this whole time. He's told them, hey, the Lord made me some promises, right? This is maybe how he's trying to be impressive in the eyes of his wives. But even what they do with the name of the Lord is they just kind of use it in this competition they have for more kids. The Lord has helped me to have more kids than my sister. Yes, now my husband is going to love me. When Rachel saw that she was not bearing Jacob any children, she became jealous of her sister. So she says to Jacob, she comes to Jacob and says this. Imagine this, husbands. She comes to Jacob and says, give me children or I'll die. What is that moment like in their marriage? Jacob gets angry with her. This is a huge fight between the two of them. Am I in the place of God who kept you from having children? How did she feel when he said that? This is an insight, an astonishing insight into the actual personal lives of these ancient people who are following God, trying to follow God. Or God is following them. Maybe that's even better. So here's what Rachel does. She has slaves. Okay, it says servants. I know that's a nice way to put it. These are slaves. She has slave girls. She has a slave girl that has been given to her by her dad when she got married. And so she brings that slave girl to Jacob. This is an established way in their culture to have children if you can't. And so she says, you, Jacob, need to sleep with my slave girl so that I can have kids through her, so that I can beat my sister. And so that happens. She has kids. Look at this. By the time she gets to 2 children, Rachel, which matches her sister, this is what she says when she has her second child through the slave girl. I've had a great struggle with my sister, but I won. And she names the kid Naphtali. Naphtali means struggle. She names the kid, I beat my sister. What kind of family is this? During the wheat harvest, Reuben went into the fields. This happens later. So Reuben is Leah's son. And he found some mandrake plants. Mandrakes were believed, it's not true, but they were believed to have fertility properties, like help you have more kids. So Reuben brings the mandrakes to Leah, and Rachel says to Leah, please give me some of your son's mandrakes. This next scene is going to give you maybe the most vivid picture of what life was like inside Jacob's family. Rachel says to Leah, please give me some of your son's mandrakes. Leah says to her, wasn't it enough that you took away my husband? Will you take my son's mandrakes too? What does she mean, took away my husband? Rachel's not letting Leah spend time with Jacob. Very well, Rachel said, I'll let Jacob sleep with you tonight if you give me your son's mandrakes. This is like, if you wanted to define dysfunctional family, like in the dictionary or something, here it is. Rachel sells Jacob's services to her sister. So when Jacob came in from the fields, imagine you're Jacob, guys. Imagine you're Jacob. Jacob came in from the fields that evening. Leah went out to meet him and said, you must sleep with me. I hired you with my son's mandrakes. So he did. Jacob is just a pawn. These women have Jacob pinned down in every way. There's no way out for him. Jacob, in response to all of this is the next scene in his life. This one we won't go into too much detail on, but in response to this, Jacob says, instead of trying to trust God, Jacob says, you know what? I'm going to be an even better manipulator than all of them. They think they've got me, well, I'm going to get them back. And he comes up with a payback scheme for his uncle. This is what Jacob does next. Okay, so I think I won't read this just for sake of time. All of these stories take a long time in Genesis. But Jacob comes up with a ridiculous idea. What he does is he goes to his uncle and he says, look, I've been working for you for a long time. You're rich, I'm not. So why don't you just give me the bad goats and the bad sheep, like the ones that are either dark colored or spotted. Okay, give me those ones. And Laban's like, okay, I don't want those ones anyway. And then Jacob has this plan, and he says, here's what I'm going to do. I'm gonna make out of tree bark, I'm going to make like this thing that's striped. Okay, it's got like black and white stripes. And I'm going to put it right in front of these goats when they mate. And then because they're mating in front of this black and white striped thing, it's like magic. Jacob is trying to do magic. Because they're mating in front of this black and white striped thing that I made, all the kids, all the baby goats and sheep that are born are going to be either dark or speckled. Would this work? The answer is no. There's no reason this should work at all. And yet what Genesis tells us is that God allowed it to work. God allowed it to work. Jacob's trying to do pagan magic, and God lets it happen because God has a plan for Jacob's life, and he's going to use this to get Jacob right where he wants him. Oh man, Jacob is making all these bad decisions, and yet God is still in control over all of it. Okay, let's skip through this part because we need to move forward. Next, what happens is Jacob becomes super rich, and he's basically stolen all this stuff from his uncle. What do you think his cousins think about this? They're not so excited, right? His uncle's children, his uncle's sons want to kill Jacob. Once again, he's got relatives who want to kill him. And right at this moment, for the first time in maybe 15, 20 years, the Lord speaks in Jacob's life. It says, the Lord said to Jacob, go back to the land of your fathers and to your relatives, and I will be with you. Time to go home, Jacob. I told you I was going to bring you back. Now I'm doing it. Jacob put his children and his wives on camels. This is the moment I was telling you about earlier. Okay, it's like the Wild West. They are getting on camels, not telling anybody, and fleeing in the middle of the night at high speed to get away from his relatives who want to kill him. All both of his wives and his 2 concubines. It's like he's got 4 wives and 11 children and all the rest of their sheep and goats. It's like, this is wild stuff. On camelback, whipping the camel with his 6-shooter on his side. No, he had his little sword strapped onto him, though. Right? Cowboy hat? No. Turban. He had a turban on. And he drove all the livestock ahead of him, along with all the goods he had accumulated in Paddan Aram, to go to his father Isaac in the land of Canaan. Isaac's not there anymore. Isaac has passed away, but this is where his father is from. Go back to his homeland. So what happens? Laban eventually catches up to him. His uncle catches up to him. Probably Jacob would have died right there, but God protects him once again. God appears to Laban and says, don't say anything to Jacob. Don't say anything to Jacob, good or bad. Why? Because he knows Laban's a manipulator. God says, you can't even talk to Jacob, or you're going to be in big trouble with me. He gives Laban a dream. So Laban gets away from his relatives who are trying to kill him behind. But now he's headed back home. And who's back home? His brother. The last time he saw his brother wanted him dead. And the next thing we see is Jacob trapped. And this is going to be the moment where God has Jacob right where he wants him. Jacob also went on his way, and the angels of God met him. At some point, as he's headed back home, toward where his brother lives, toward where he grew up, he sees some sort of spiritual being. Nobody else sees it. But Jacob sees an angel, and he realizes, he thinks again. Remember when he left home, he had this moment where he had this vision of angels going up and down from heaven. And he thought, this is the place where God lives. So this is what he thinks again. This is the place where God lives. This is the camp of God. And he called the place Mahanaim, which means 2 camps. Meaning the camp of God, which you can't see, and the camp of Jacob, which you can see. God is here camped with us. Jacob sent messengers ahead of him to his brother Esau in the land of Seir, the country of Edom. So he sends some messengers, some of his slaves. He sends to Esau to say, hi, Esau, I'm back, and I really, really love you. You are my favorite brother ever, and I'm going to give you a lot of stuff. It's going to be amazing. We can be brothers again. He wants to see if Esau still wants to kill him. The messengers return to Jacob. Here's what they say. Hey, we went to see your brother Esau, and he's coming to meet you with 400 armed men. That's what we're talking about here. He's coming to meet you, with an army. What does Jacob think? I'm dead. He doesn't have 400 armed men. He's got some servants. He's got his kids. His oldest son is maybe a teenager at this point. 400 armed men with his brother. Remember what his brother's like? Manly dude, mountain man. I'm dead. So in great fear and distress, Jacob divided the people who were with him into 2 groups. Basically, he divides his own family so that if his brother attacks, only half of his family will die and maybe the other half can escape. This is the only plan he can come up with. And then, this is probably 20 years after he first meets the Lord, for the first time in the text, it says this, then Jacob prayed. For 20 years, he doesn't pray. At least it doesn't say he does. Why does he pray? Because he's about to die. God has put him in a trap to lead him back to God, to make Jacob realize he's not the one in control. God is the one in control, and he needs to turn to God for help. All of this was designed by God to bring Jacob right where he wants him. Has God ever put you in a trap like this? I don't know. You have to tell me later. I'd love to hear your stories. He prays, oh God of my father Abraham, God of my father Isaac, Lord, you said to me, go back to your country and your relatives and I'll make you prosper. You said it, Lord. No longer, see what Jacob's doing here? Now it's no longer my plan, my country, Lord, this was all your idea. Well, it wasn't really. He did all kinds of stuff that wasn't God's idea. But now he's going to say, Lord, you're the one in control. That night, Jacob got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, his 11 sons, and he crossed the ford of the Jabbok. After he had sent them across the stream, he sent over all his possessions. He makes it so that he's alone on one side of the river. And Jacob was left alone, and something incredible happens in this moment. A man wrestled with him till daybreak. Now, we don't know who this is at first when it appears in the text, but it becomes very clear. I don't think Jacob knows who it is at first. He's alone by himself. He's probably praying in the middle of the night, and some guy shows up and starts fighting with him. But what turns out to be is this is an angel. This is an angel sent by God. And let me ask you this question. Who starts this fight? Often I've heard it portrayed that Jacob starts this fight. Jacob finishes it in some ways, but the angel starts the fight. Jacob's praying, and a guy shows up and starts fighting him. When the man saw that he could not overpower Jacob, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. Jacob will limp for the rest of his life, permanently injured in this moment. Then the man said, "Let me go. It's daytime. They've wrestled all night, maybe 4, 5, 6 hours." Think what Jacob feels like at this moment. But Jacob will not give up because he knows he's dead. And he's started to realize this is someone who's sent to me by God. This is an angel I'm wrestling with. Jacob says, "I won't let you go unless you bless me." Do you think this angel could have won the fight at any moment? Do you think? What's the point of this fight? Why is God fighting with Jacob? This is just like Lieutenant Dan. It's just like it. This moment where Jacob's going to get out everything that's been in him. He's going to finally get real with God. And what getting real with God looks like is fighting. He says, "I'm not going to let you go unless you bless me." The man asked him, "What's your name?" Do you think the angel doesn't know what Jacob's name is? Why does he ask Jacob his name? Do you remember what Jacob means? The angel is saying to Jacob, admit it right now. We've been fighting all night. Admit it right now. Who are you really? And what does Jacob say? He says, here's who I really am. I'm the one who causes my brother to stumble. I'm a con man. I'm a liar. And the angel looks at him and he says, not anymore. Your name will no longer be Jacob. Your name is now Israel. Israel means, the El is the word for God. And the Isra means fight. His name is Fight God. It probably means several things. It means he fights with God. He fights against God. It also means that God fights for him. That's what's happened his whole life. He's been fighting against God, and the whole time God has been fighting for him. The angel says, you have struggled with God and with humans. Yeah, no kidding. And you have overcome. Overcome what? Himself. Jacob has overcome himself. Jacob said, please tell me your name. The angel's like, you can't handle my name, buddy. Okay. But he blessed him. It's amazing that Jacob holds out for this blessing because he already has it. God has blessed him repeatedly, but he doesn't believe it. The angel blesses him once again. And Jacob calls the place Peniel, which means the face of God, because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was somehow spared. The sun rose above him as he passed Peniel, and he was limping because of his hip. Therefore, to this day, the Israelites do not eat the tendon attached to the socket of the hip, because the socket of Jacob's hip was touched near the tendon. God picks a fight with Jacob in this scene, and he lets Jacob win. This is the kind of God we serve. This is another famous painting, and I think this one of Jacob's struggle with the angel gives us also a good sense of what it was like. You see Jacob going at it with all his might, and you see the angel kind of just going like this. I guess I can't beat you, Jacob. I'll have to bless you. Jacob, the manipulator, entered this match, and Israel emerges. The one who has wrestled with God and finally gotten real with him. He fights with God, and God fights for him. He releases control to God, who he realizes, finally, after all these years, Jacob realizes God was always in control anyway. For the rest of Jacob's life, he is by no means perfect, we're going to see. But he no longer tries to control things. He no longer tries to manipulate the people around him or make things turn out a certain way. He's not striving for some goal. The rest of his life, he lives like this. Whatever the Lord brings, I'm going to put my trust in him. What does this mean for me? We'll just say this as we wrap up for this morning. What does this mean for me in my life? It means that God is the one who's really in control. But if God's in control, do my choices matter? Of course your choices matter. There's often this debate, are humans have free will or is God the one in control? Just look at a story like Jacob. Did Jacob have free will? Yes. Who was in control of Jacob's life? Obviously God. Obviously God. God is so great that he gives you freedom and he's still in control. Stop trying to control your life. Go to God. Wrestle with him. Find faith and find peace. Let's pray. We'll continue in worship.